Welcome to week number 2. I'm sure this is not how you expected your second week of this class to be, and I do apologize for the inconvenience. But I do want you to know that I'm going to do everything that I can to help you successfully proceed through the material this week. And I'm going to try to make sure that in this video, I explain some of these basic economic concepts that you will find in Chapter 2. You should have read Chapter 1 already from last week, because this week we're going to begin in Chapter 2. If you've had microeconomics, you have probably read these chapters and realized that you were already introduced to these concepts. But I want you to know that after Chapter 2, this really does become a different class. If you've never had economics before, please don't worry. I'm assuming that my students have not had economics, and so I'm trying to present material as though this was a blank slate and that you were learning these things for the very first time. So just by way of reviewing, in Chapter 1, you discovered that economics is all about the idea that scarcity forces us to make choices. We have choices that we have to make because there's a limited amount of resources that we have to work with. And so the book talked about what that means to have a limited amount of resources. This is a basic building block for understanding all of economics, whether it's micro or macro. Everything comes back down to the idea of scarcity, which forces us to make choices. Now, when we make our choices, we have a decision to make. If we choose one thing, that means we're not doing something else. That concept is what's called an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is the value of the next best thing. It's what you would have done. It's your second choice. So, for example, if you were to decide that for the next 30 minutes you're going to study economics, if you weren't going to study economics, you would have gone and done the dishes. Now, there's all kinds of other things that you could be doing in the next 30 minutes, but your second choice was doing the dishes. So your opportunity cost for spending the next 30 minutes studying economics is what you're going to give up. The dishes aren't going to be done. As another example, some of you, if you weren't studying economics right now, you would be at work, maybe even earning a paycheck. So the opportunity cost of you watching this video right now might be you're giving up a paycheck. Now remember, opportunity cost is the value of the next best thing. It's what you would have done. It's not the value of all the possible outcomes and all the possible things that could be done with your resources. It's just what would have been done. If you chose this, it means you gave up your second choice. That's the opportunity cost. Now, when we think about our decisions, we tend to think on the margin. What that means is we think incrementally. We don't think in terms of all or nothing. We think in increments, tiny changes in our behavior. So for example, at the end of the month, I might have consumed 6 gallons of milk, but I don't ever go out at the beginning of the month and purchase 6 gallons of milk. I buy 1 gallon, and then when that's done, I'll go buy the second gallon. And when that's done, I'll go buy the third gallon. That's what's called marginal thinking. You think incrementally. You think incrementally. So when we look at our decisions and we look at what's possible with our resources, we have a model that's called the production possibilities frontier or the production possibilities curve. But this model describes all the possible combinations of things that you could do with your resources that you have. So for example, let's take the United States and say that they have enough resources to produce various amounts of these two things, either goods or services. So we're going to use this information, which really is just describing 4 possible outcomes, and this is hypothetical. So when we graph this, these are 4 points on a graph. So this first point is where there's 10,000 hours of services, but if everybody's over on the service side, there's no goods that are going to be produced. So that's that first point. We could move to the point where there's 8 of each. We have enough resources to make 8 million trucks of goods and 8,000 hours of services. And on down, and you have a production possibilities frontier. And this frontier describes sort of the limit of what is possible for you to actually do with your resources. So any point on this frontier is called efficient. You are efficiently using up your resources. So you could produce any combination on that frontier and efficiently use up your resources. However, what if we decide that, you know, we really don't just want to have this amount of resources? What if, let me backtrack, sorry. What if we decided we only wanted to produce 6 services and 2 million truckloads of industrial goods? So that's a point that's going to be in this area underneath that frontier. So the point 8,000 services and 2 million truckloads of industrial goods is actually underneath the frontier. And so that would be an inefficient point. You have resources left over. You could make more. Now, the shape of this frontier describes a law, which is the law of increasing opportunity costs. As you move from one point to the next point, the opportunity cost will change. So for example, if we move from the point of making 10 services and 0 goods to 8 and 8, we're actually going to be able to gain some industrial goods, but we're going to lose 2,000 hours of the services. So we gain 8 million trucks of goods when we move from one point to the next, but we lose 2,000 hours of services. So that's a loss of 1 good for, we lose a quarter of a service for every 1 good that we gain. As we move from one point to the next point, as I go from 8 to 9, remember, think incrementally. I'm going to go from 8 to 9 million truckloads of industrial goods. I'm going to lose 3,000 hours of services. So while I gained 1 million truckloads of goods, I lost 3 services in the process. And if I go even further and go from 9 to 10 industrial goods, I'm going to go from 5 to 0 on the services. So for every 1 industrial good that I gain, I've lost 5 technological services. So you'll notice that the more you produce of something, the more you're going to have to give up. The law of increasing opportunity cost will always apply. And it simply means that we give up more and more every time we produce or provide more services. The opportunity cost increases. And so this is explained in the curve of a production possibilities frontier. Now, the last thing to really talk about has to do with the idea that while we may have this frontier, what if we really wanted to produce beyond the frontier? What if I wanted to produce 10 of each, goods and services? That's beyond the frontier. And actually, I don't have the resources to do that. So the only way to get that point is to have what's called economic growth. And if you get economic growth, then the entire line will shift outwards. You can produce more of everything. And that shift outwards will occur if you get more resources and more technology, and that curve will shift outwards. That's the only way to be able to produce more of everything, is to get that economic growth. So what we've learned and reviewed, the basic concepts of scarcity, which forces us to make choices. Then we recognize that when we make our choices, we look at our trade-offs, and that's our opportunity cost. And if we're going to do something, we recognize we have to give up something else in order to make that happen, because there's a limited amount of resources. So we look at our opportunity cost and we make our decisions, but we make them incrementally. We make them on the margin. We think in incremental changes. And then when we put all of our decisions together, we look at what's possible in what's called the production possibilities frontier. And the frontier simply describes what's possible for you to do given your resources that you have to work with. If you're on the frontier, you're efficiently using your resources. If you're producing under the frontier, then you're inefficient in using your resources. And if you really want to produce something outside the frontier, the only way to do that is to achieve economic growth. And you get that by acquiring more resources or getting more technology. So these are the basic fundamentals of economics. In the next chapter that we read, chapter 15, we'll begin talking about how we look at the macroeconomy and how we measure the size of the macroeconomy.